We are going to hear from Chris Yogerst about his book, Hollywood Hates Hitler, Jew Baiting, Anti-Nazism, and the Senate Investigations into Warmongering into the Motion Pictures. As we're starting, I always like to say, be patient with any technical glitches. We've already had one, so hopefully that'll be it for today. And also, if you have questions or challenges, please throw those into chat, and we'll respond to them just as quickly as Cassie told me right there that she couldn't hear you, that she couldn't hear me. We suggest that you put this in speaker view as opposed to gallery view, so then you get kind of an up close of the speaker as Chris is talking. That's up in the right corner if you're on a computer. It's in other places if you're on a tablet or phone. But we all know you've been doing Zooms for about 1 year and 2 months now, so we have great faith in your ability to do this. I know many of you have already donated to support this program today, and many of you are members. We appreciate all that you do to help the museum in this challenging time. If you haven't yet donated and are able to, we would appreciate if you could. There will be a link in the chat, so feel free to go ahead and support us in any way that you can. You also have the opportunity to buy the book, which Cassie will put a link in the chat to that as well. I want to talk a little bit about how we came to meet Chris and to get this program started. I met Chris a couple of years ago when our Hollywood Blacklist exhibit was up, and he told me about these Senate hearings. And as someone who is both a student of history, a student of American history, a student of this particular time period, I was shocked that I didn't know anything about this time period, about this investigation into warmongering. But I think this is such an important period in American life, and it points to so many aspects of what we're experiencing right now. So I'm delighted that once Chris's book was out, we were able to get on board and say, yeah, we can add this to our programming calendar, because I think it has so much resonance with the period that we're looking at, but also in understanding American responses around World War II and understanding how we get to an experience like the Blacklist and how you have that uneasy relationship between Hollywood and the government. So I'm really excited to see how this all comes together, and I hope you guys will enjoy it as much as I know I am going to. Without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce our speaker today. Chris Yogerst is a film and media historian who focuses on the social and cultural impact of popular culture. His research shows that pop culture often mirrors society in many ways that add important context towards understanding our world, which I think we all see all the time, and having someone bring it together is so nice. His work can be found in the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Washington Post, the Hollywood Reporter, and numerous academic journals. This book examines the 1941 Senate investigation into the motion picture propaganda, and it is released by the University Press of Mississippi. Please welcome Chris Yogerst.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me? Are we all good? Awesome. All right, thanks, Ellie. Yeah, this is exciting because when we met, I was just starting this. I was just starting the writing. I had the book contract, and I'd already been to the National Archives, and I dug into some of this stuff. So it's great to finally bring this full circle and be able to share it with a group who I think would be passionately interested in it. And like Ellie said, there's a lot of continued. Trying to multitask here. Let me share my screen. Sadly, continued relevance for this kind of stuff. Particularly these days where we see, there's lots of talk of anti-racism, but there's anti-Semitism seems to get lost in this a lot, and it's quite frustrating. So just see if I can see my whole screen here. There we go. Okay, so here is my first screen, second screen. All right, well, I have a bunch of, how do I move this? There we go. All right, I had a bunch of people on the side. I couldn't see my whole slide. All right, so a little bit, I guess, just to set up this. There we go. Just to set this up just a little bit. So the the Senate investigation is something that, like Ellie said, I mean, it's not a lot of people know about it unless you're real deep in the weeds in film history. And a lot of the reason is probably good. I mean, the senators were largely embarrassed, and they kind of went down as a laughing stock after this. So all of I looked at all of the senators that were involved in this hearing. All of their autobiographies purposely omit this period of history because it didn't make them look good. It didn't really go anywhere. So this is something we can actually kind of proudly look back on and be like, all right, anti-Semitism was stopped and this kind of crap was buried. But then, of course, World War II happened. That was a whole nother major issue that needed to be dealt. But why this is important, even though it didn't go anywhere as an investigation, it's important because of what led to it. So I think that's, and just even paging back through my book last night, I'm neck deep into a whole nother book right now. So I'm going back through stuff I wrote a couple of years ago, and it's like there was so much going on leading up to 1941. Even paging through my own book, I'm reminded of things I had already forgot. And it's just, the 1930s are just, they constantly fascinate me just in terms of how much was going on and how much was set in motion that we're still feeling today. So I want to talk a little bit about that as we get up to the investigation. So the 1930s, incredibly polarized. I'm reminded of, during that Blacklist series that Ellie mentioned, Tony Khan gave a really good talk, and he was talking about, he's like, I remember him saying something like, if you thought it's polarized under Trump, you should have been around in the 40s, in the 50s. And, I had that in my mind while I was researching this book, and I kept coming back to that because everything I learned about the 30s made everything we feel that is such a big deal today seem like nothing. The tensions were just incredible. And of course, you've got the Great Depression in here. You've got the rise of pretty upfront Nazism, both home and abroad. You have people like Father Charles Coughlin on the radio. You see him pictured here in the middle. Who was eventually, by the end of the decade, booted off the radio for his rhetoric, but he continued to publish a magazine called Social Justice, strangely enough titled. And it was through this magazine that he had his writers really support the Senate investigation that we lead to eventually. And of course, you have the push and pull between isolationism versus interventionism. And this is something that I remember growing up and hearing about World War II and thinking that this was, World War II was this widely accepted war. And the more I learn about the 1930s, it was not at all. And a lot of you, I'm sure, already know that. But it's this push and pull between isolationism and interventionism that was so aggressive and so nasty on several outlets of the national press and in national figures and all this kind of stuff that really set at least the cultural tensions in motion that led to the Senate investigation. Another major thing that really, it might have been like the last straw to really put the isolationists over the edge is when President Roosevelt signed the Lend-Lease bill. So this was early 1941. It was being debated in late 1940. And this was basically, if you're not familiar with it, it was the United States sending aid to Britain to try to fend off the Nazis. It was pretty much sending everything except for soldiers. So money, planes, boats, munitions, you name it, in hopes that they could defeat the Nazis and we wouldn't have to go to war. And this is something that a lot of the isolationists would they brand people as interventionists really quickly, saying, oh, you want war. And even people like Harry Warner and some of the studio moguls would come out and say, no, we don't want war. We just want this to stop. We actually want peace. So if we can do something to stop it now, let's do it. But that certainly wasn't enough. So this, again, tensions continue to rise. Of course, you have one. I guess I should note the two books that I have pictured here. I just want to recommend because they're very influential in my setting up of this book. Hitler in Los Angeles by Steve Ross talks about the underground funding of anti-Nazi espionage in Los Angeles in the 30s, which was huge. So this is kind of solidifies how early the media, the studio moguls in Hollywood knew about the growth of Nazism in the United States as early as 33, 34, 35. And then Sarah Churchwell's book about the history of the term America First. And it gives us a lot of interesting context and really fills in a lot of gaps into how we got to where we are today. So the America First movement, of course, is known for a lot of things. In the 1930s, it got a lot of attention for its rhetoric. You have John Flynn here and Charles Lindbergh. Most of you probably know Lindbergh. You might not know Flynn. John T. Flynn he was one of these people who I kind of describe him as like a Roger Stone kind of figure. And I still want to learn more about this guy. I'm fascinated, but he's one of these people where he's not a politician. He's not like an influential businessman, but he has like all of the connections, and you don't really know how he operates, but he somehow gets things done. It's kind of one of these kind of scary, kind of dark power. I don't know where he gets it from. But anyway, he was big in the America First movement in New York. And of course, Lindbergh was on the national stage going all over the country. And the America First movement, really known for kind of its fearless anti-Semitism. It really wasn't trying to hide it. It was talking about, 100% Americanism and all this kind of stuff. And looking at any kind of foreigner as an enemy. So you have all of this going on at the same time that's really fueling these tensions. And of course, Lindbergh would go on to go after Hollywood specifically and talk about how Hollywood, in one of his speeches, I'm trying to remember if it was the Des Moines one or if it was prior to that, but he had actually singled out Hollywood and the Jewish control of the media as the biggest threat to America in the late 30s, early 40s. So that kind of tells you where they were on this stuff. Also, you have the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League. So this is something that Tom Doherty has written a lot about. He wrote a book called Hollywood and Hitler, 1933 to 39, that gives you a lot of great history of the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League, which was really part of this, what was called the Popular Front movement, where it was lots of differing ideologies united against Hitler. And of course, once the Hitler-Stalin Pact comes in, that all crumbles. But in the meantime, by 35, 36 or so, you have this popular front of ideologies coming together to oppose Nazism. And while this is going on the left here, you see a pamphlet that was put together by Henry Allen and distributed by Arno Risi and a bunch of other people in Los Angeles. And you can see, again, the rhetoric here, very, very open. They're calling for Christian vigilantes. They want you to boycott the movies. They're, again, the fear of Jews and communism, two things that are often conflated during this era. And this was spread all over Los Angeles. So this is the kind of stuff that, and actually one of them, I can't remember if it was this one specifically or something very similar, was actually slipped into the LA Times around this late 30s as well. So then everybody had that, something like this sitting on their doorstep when they opened up the newspaper in the morning. So in the late 1930s, especially specifically in LA, there was a lot of very open fascist talk and action and movement. And even though the anti-Nazi espionage was going on, it really wasn't getting anywhere. They would take their findings to the chief of police in LA, and they frankly said they didn't care. And one of the spies actually sent a lot of this stuff to the Senate in 1940. They didn't really seem to care. So that gives you a sense, again, of where not only the local government in LA was, but also the national government was kind of sweeping this under the rug. So on the right here, there's just some pamphlets and some advertisements for Anti-Nazi League events. You see on the right there, John Ford was a speaker, one of my favorite directors. So what we see amidst this is anti-authoritarian films. And this is important because Hollywood had a production code that stated many things, among the fact that you couldn't ridicule other nations or religions and a long list of things like that. So it was against the code to go after a country. So they had to be very clever about how they did this. So you saw things like, a major film like Adventures of Robin Hood, pretty straightforward, just anti-authoritarian. You have a film like Blockade produced by independent producer Walter Wanger, which deals with the Spanish Civil War, and Henry Fonda has a very famous call for peace at the end of that movie. But once you get into actually, several films by Warner Brothers, They Won't Forget deals with a thinly veiled version of the Leo Frank case from the 19-teens, which was a major case of anti-Semitism and United States miscarriage of justice. So they dig that back up in 1937. You've got the story of Emile Zola, and that brings up debates of the Dreyfus case, and then my favorite of these, Black Legion with Humphrey Bogart, incredibly powerful film that shows the influence of people like Charles Coughlin and this kind of hateful rhetoric. Humphrey Bogart plays a character who doesn't get a promotion, and he starts listening to this radio preacher who's really angry and really racist and prejudiced, and he starts getting all kinds of ideas of why he didn't get the job, and he starts taking that out. He joins the Black Legion, and it goes downhill from there. A fun fact about that movie, actually, the KKK sued Warner Brothers for using some of their insignia and some of their wardrobe and all this kind of stuff. And not only did they lose the case, they were asked to pay all of Warner Brothers legal fees. So that was pretty awesome. I love that. So you have these, and again, it's important to remember at this time, they're not saying Nazi, they're not using the word Jew, they're being very careful about how they're doing this. But when you watch them, watching for a little bit of coded language, you can pick all this stuff up. But once we hit 1939, this all changes. And Warner Brothers releases Confessions of a Nazi Spy, and this is really known as the movie that kind of broke the dam. It was the watershed moment, and every other studio mostly started putting out anti-Nazi movies. And Confessions of a Nazi Spy was based on a real case, a real espionage case that was exposed in New York. So they were, just like they had been doing for the gangster films and the Depression films, they were ripping from the headlines. So they started taking, it was Leon Theroux was the FBI agent. They started interviewing him and getting his story, and they made it into a movie. So other studios started doing the same thing, but you can even see at the top, you have The Man I Married, which was originally to be released as I Married a Nazi, but the name was changed. So you can still see that they're a little worried about doing this and putting this out there like that, because there's all kinds of ramifications. There's other history here, as studios were afraid to pull their product out of Europe coming out of the Depression. They were afraid to cut funding streams. Although Warner Brothers was the first to do that in 1933, as soon as Hitler came to power, they pulled their stuff out of Germany very quickly. So you have other films, Manhunt, Fritz Lang's great film, Four Sons, and it's an okay film. The Mortal Storm, one of the most powerful of these, MGM, Jimmy Stewart, and then The Great Dictator, of course, Charlie Chaplin, absolutely wonderful film. Escape was another good one, and then Underground, another Warner Brothers film about a mobile radio unit that is fueling or informing the resistance, and they just have to move every couple days because the Nazis learn where they are. So all of this is coming on. This is all pre-Pearl Harbor, pre-U.S. entry into the war. So it was, but and these are all really powerful films and very interesting films. It's still the minority of movies. Studios were making hundreds of movies a year. They had a handful of these. So it was such a small percentage, but they're important, and they're very historically important. So 1939, 1940, they start to kind of push the production code aside and find a little bit more comfort, at least making some movies going after the Nazis directly. So this is when it gets really, really, really tense. One of the things I found, I'm trying to remember if this was in the National Archives or that was Cal State Northridge, but there were pamphlets going around after Warner Brothers released Confessions of a Nazi Spy. Hermann Schwinn, who's the West Coast leader of the German-American Bund, helped put together and distribute a pamphlet that had, actually, let me find my quote here, many things. It was titled Suicide of the Hollywood Motion Picture Industry. The main argument was that there was an employment problem that existed in the film industry. And it argued, quote, the Jewish monopoly of the motion picture industry brazenly discharges non-Jewish men and women and replaces them with refugee Jews from Europe. So they're making this weird argument about immigrants coming in and taking jobs. You can see the anti-Semitism in there. But what really hammered that home was what I have here in the middle. And at the end of this pamphlet was a breakdown of a lot of people who worked on the production of Confessions of a Nazi Spy. And I've bolded here, it wasn't bolded in the pamphlet, but you notice every person they mentioned, they're like, this person was a Jew, this person was a Jew. They use Edward G. Robinson's original name, Emanuel Goldberg. And of course, they say he was a communist supporter of Leon Trotsky, again, conflating the politics here. So all of this stuff really just hammers home pamphlets like this, where you can see where their true colors are. They're not really concerned about jobs, right? They're concerned about Jews coming in. And it was very clear in this kind of stuff. And that's probably why, they started making movies like this. They were seeing this kind of stuff in their backyard in Los Angeles, and they were done with it. Harry Warner, I always like to single him out for a few things. Going back to 1938, he actually had a party at his house where he invited a bunch of power players in Hollywood to read and discuss this book called Common Ground, a plea for intelligent Americanism. And it's really a fascinating book to read today, because it's just as relevant, just trying to find bridges between politics and ideologies and religions to try to create harmony. He was pushing this with his friends in 1930. By 1940, he gave a speech at the studio called United We Survive, Divided We Fall. And he basically tells all of his employees that he had been traveling in Europe, and he's terrified because a lot of the leaders he knows there they don't feel like war is going to happen. They don't feel like it's going to get worse. Although by 1940, when we, knowing what we know now, looking back at history, it's hard to think, how can you not see where this is going? But of course, there was a lot of people who were just thought, it'll pass. So he gives this speech, and he gave lots of speeches like this. So it, again, gives you a sense of where the Warner Brothers were. So what this leads to, so this is a little bit of what's going on at the time. There was also in the summer of 1941, an isolationist event and an interventionist event at the Hollywood Bowl. So there are these competing events right there in Hollywood, rallying for or against intervention. So this stuff, it was like, again, every time I looked through my book, I find another little tidbit of something that was happening. I mean, it was like every day there was another major event or talk or speech or something. So where this led was the Senate Resolution 152, which was the picture on the left here. Actually, both these pictures I took in the National Archives. And this resolution called to investigate motion picture propaganda. And eventually it would be amended by Senator Nye very quickly to also include discussions of monopolistic practices in Hollywood, which eventually would make changes. It would actually, an argument that would take off, and by 1948 would result in the Paramount decrees. And that's a whole nother story. But here are the players on the right here. You have Clark Nye, Toby Brooks, and Bone. Bone ended up he got sick and wasn't able to show up, but he was originally on the correspondence. You have Clark and Nye, who were regulars at America First rallies. In fact, Worth Clark was one of the speakers at the Hollywood Bowl isolationist event in the summer of 41. But I've singled out Mcfarland at the bottom there, who, after doing all this research, Ernest Mcfarland became one of my favorite people in history, because he was a junior senator, a very prominent lawyer from Arizona, then a junior senator by 1941. He was brought onto this committee. And I think Clark and I just thought, here's this young guy. He's just going to follow our lead. We'll teach the kids some things. What they didn't do is learn about how smart of a lawyer he was, and the fact that he might ask questions. So he did, and I'll get to some of that in a minute, but it was really Mcfarland that helped unravel a lot of this from the inside. Let's see here. All right. So we have, once this is set in motion, going to start in September 41. Will Hayes, we have here on the left, who was the head of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors Association, which is now the MPAA. He brings in Wendell Wilkie to defend Hollywood, who was a popular former presidential candidate, a very just popular politician, very accomplished, very well-spoken, really good person to come in and do this. Although one of the problems is the Senate muzzled Wilkie and they wouldn't let him speak during the investigation. But really what this created was, it was great to read the press, because what he would do, he would sit in the hearing room all day, get incredibly mad. And as soon as the day was done, after the last gavel, he would go talk to the press and he would just unload. And that's actually how I started this book project. I was looking at some other files at Cal State Northridge, and I found a big folder of of press clippings from the investigation, and just reading through it, it was incredible. And I was aware of the investigation, but I didn't realize how big of a deal it was in terms of how widespread the national coverage was. It wasn't just the Hollywood press. It was all over the place. Chicago, New York, Boston, LA, Wall Street Journal, everybody covered this thing. And it was syndicated into local papers, all kinds of stuff. So, all right, let's see here. So we got Wilkie, he's ready to go. So the investigations is going. Here's a lot of people that they've subpoenaed. I'll talk about a few of them here in a minute. But as you see here, yeah, this from Motion Picture Daily, where they mentioned that Wilkie is not able to speak, although he did mutter enough things that got attention during it was kind of fun to reading the transcripts. They actually included some of that. So when we start, so September 9th, 1941, Gerald Nye starts this off, and he's really the one who put all this together. But it starts on this day and also starts to unravel on this day. You can see the Film Daily headline there, not very favorable. And you can see, I guess, fun fact about Gerald Nye, Wisconsin native. So it's another Wisconsin native politician that we cannot be proud of, but eventually moved to the Dakotas and started his career there. He was a journalist and worked his way up. But what he did, so he also added, he kept going back about the monopoly stuff. You could get a sense that reading the transcripts of his testimony, you get a sense that by the time this started, it was too late to stop it. And he had a feeling that he wasn't going to get anywhere with the propaganda. So he started pushing the monopoly stuff. What's great about this is that Mcfarland started asking questions. So Mcfarland had been listening to Nye. Nye had been at America First rallies. And one of the things that Nye had said is that Hollywood movies are trying to make America punch drunk for propaganda to push us into war. So Mcfarland asked a great question, which is simply, what's wrong with these movies? And he very honest. He's like, look, Senator, I don't watch movies. I'm not a movie guy. Can you tell me a little bit about these? What's the problem with them? And Nye was clueless, absolutely clueless. And so Mcfarland started going through each movie. Well, what about The Mortal Storm? What about Confessions of a Nazi Spy? What about That Hamilton Woman? And he was like, I can't remember. I saw it so long ago. And eventually it came out that he hadn't seen any of them. And he put this entire Senate investigation together based on good information. Speaking like a true politician, I heard it from good information from a trusted source. And likely this source was John Flynn, from what I could tell from some of the correspondence at the National Archives. As well as there was another man right on the radio, G. Allison Phelps, who had put together a few pamphlets in Hollywood that were very anti-Hollywood, also very anti-Semitic. One of them was titled An American's History of Hollywood. And you could read between the lines there. There's a lot in the text there about, the Hollywood Jews not being real Americans and all this kind of stuff. So one of the other things that Nye mentioned on this day is that he tried to bring up The Mortal Storm, and even though he hadn't seen it, and he said that Frank Borzage, the director, had actually been replaced, and Victor Seville had been brought in. And Seville was a British propagandist, and Seville had been brought in to direct the movie, to finish the movie, because the movie wasn't propagandistic enough. And Borzage wired Washington that day and said, "No, I directed my movie." And I think we can believe it because it was Borzage directly. If it had been like Eddie Mannix or one of the PR guys at MGM, maybe a different story. But Borzage himself wired directly and said no. So really, Nye's day, it was a dumpster fire. Nothing really happened. All we really saw was how ignorant he really was about the arguments he was trying to push. Things really didn't get a whole lot better the second day. And one of the things with Clark is that he echoed Nye, but one of the things he added, he echoed some of the monopoly stuff, but one of the things he added, and this is where the really true colors were, and is that he complained that movies had a bigger reach than politicians. So basically, he was jealous that movies could reach more people than he could. He complained about not being featured in enough newsreels or on the radio and all this kind of stuff. And basically, it wasn't fair. He said movies were, elected officials deserve the top platform of reach in mass communication, not politicians. So that was really one of his big arguments. So we could just see how jealous he was. And again, that really didn't go anywhere. And then Flynn finally comes up. So this was September 9th and then 11th. So Flynn's really the only one who tries to bring some kind of evidence. He actually makes a list of movies, as you see here, and went studio by studio, looked at some of the British films. But like the two senators before, he couldn't really fill in the gaps of why these movies were bad, and very quickly switched to the monopoly angle. Also had a good back and forth with Mcfarland. Mcfarland said, I've read some of your pamphlets, as you see here. He wrote the Road to Socialism pamphlet. And Mcfarland said, well, you obviously like propaganda because you write it, so you just don't like propaganda you don't agree with. So he started hammering him like this. The audience was applauding, and this started to unravel pretty quickly as well. Let's see. Oh, and one of the other significant things about this day, on this same day, on September 11th, 1941, Lindbergh gave his infamous Des Moines speech at an America First rally, where he called Jews one of the biggest threats to the United States. So this is happening as this investigation is going on. So it just gives you a sense of, there's so many layers to this kind of all happening at once, really kind of exploding. So you've got Flynn, again, he at least brought forth some evidence, didn't really go anywhere. Then Nye brought in a few people he thought were going to be major bombshells. Jimmy Fiddler was a journalist in Hollywood. I've come to learn probably the most hated journalist in Hollywood. I was reminded last night, going back through my notes, Walter Wanger actually wrote an article in Liberty magazine going after journalists like Fiddler, referring to him as chiseling and as a leech, and as just kind of writing about Hollywood as a way to get onto studio lots and to meet the stars and not actually bringing any content or expertise to the table. But he was a syndicated columnist. It was very clear that he did not like Hollywood. He actually said that he hated Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator so much he wished it hadn't been made. But just makes me so much more happy that it was made, because it's a wonderful film. And he conflicted himself a lot too. He spoke about how important free speech was while condemning Hollywood for using it. Although that was actually one of the arguments that Nye brought. Nye actually brought up a winning argument, legally speaking, that he let fall by the wayside, which was that movies don't have free speech. And at the time, this was actually true. Going back to the 19-teens, D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation actually led to a Supreme Court case that found, among other things, that movies were not protected speech like newspapers and journalists, all kinds of other things. Movies were not included in that. So they actually could have pushed that angle and maybe got somewhere, but he brought that up and let it go. So whatever. They also brought in George Fisher. I don't know why Nye thought this was going to be a bombshell. He worked for Warner Brothers radio station. So he was on Team Warner Brothers. So he was pretty much defended the studios, and that he didn't throw them under the bus like Mcfarland thought was going to happen. So, it continues to unravel. Then there's a recess. And it's a really fun part of this, because you can see the national press just go wild during the recess and just lambasting the senators for this. But when they reconvene on, September 23rd, They bring in Nick Schenck, who was the president of Lowe's. Lowe's owned MGM, which was the biggest studio in Hollywood at the time. So they thought this was definitely an important person to bring in. But they really didn't do any research on Schenck as well. And this almost this entire session, it lasted a day and a half, was basically Schenck teaching the senators how Hollywood operated. So there was really no discussion of propaganda. It was basically, here's how the business works. What's most important for this day is that the Film Daily, and now the Film Daily no longer around, but the Film Daily was as big as Hollywood Reporter and Variety are today, major trade magazine. They put out a poll, and you can see here they sent it to 200 critics. They got 113 responses, and they asked a bunch of questions. Most importantly, at the bottom, they asked, do you believe Congress should take action which would make it impossible for the production of these kinds of anti-Nazi pictures? And every single one of the critics that responded unanimously said no, that Congress should not take action here. So that gives you a sense. And then again, this isn't just Hollywood. I mean, this is in the Hollywood press, but the critics that they sent to were all over the country. So that gives you a sense of the tide turning on this as well. So let's see here. They bring in Howard Dietz, who's publicity at MGM. Again, I don't know why they thought this was it went nowhere as well. He basically just explained how publicity works. He taught them about the star system, but not really, did not give them nothing to bite on to push for these against the anti-Nazi movies. So again, it just kind of fell short. Things really took off when Harry Warner came. Now this is important for a lot of reasons, because the Warner Brothers were not only the first to make a major anti-Nazi movie, of course, the first studio to pull their product out of Germany. They were also the studio that was the most fearless about identifying as Jewish in the early 20th century. I mean, even their first synchronized sound major film, The Jazz Singer, was about a Jewish family, right? A rabbi hoping his kid was gonna follow his footsteps into the church. Instead, he wanted to go perform on the stage. So they really, in an era where a lot of the other founding fathers of Hollywood hid their heritage and their faith in hopes to assimilate, the Warner Brothers were pretty staunch, particularly Harry Warner, about wearing this on his sleeve and being proud of it, and not only being proud of it, but by being proud of his own heritage while urging people of different stripes to be the same. And it's one of my favorite things about Harry Warner. So he comes, and very strong-spoken man, the kind of person who didn't speak a lot, but when he did speak, he commanded attention. And not only did he command attention, but he sat down after however many days and weeks of this hearing and basically told the senators, look, I'm going to read a statement and you're going to listen, and you're not going to interrupt me, and we'll do questions afterwards. And he read a very long statement, and they did not interrupt him. And of course, at this part, the isolationist senators were all kind of like kicked puppies, but he went after the senators. He talked about his family's history, getting into the country, getting into the industry, what they had to overcome, and also the fact that all their movies are based on headlines. That was, Warner Brothers ripped from the headlines. As the title of my first book about the birth of Warner Brothers was titled "From the Headlines to Hollywood," because that's exactly what Warner Brothers did, and all of their anti-Nazi stuff, all their anti-Nazi movies were based on stories that were reported. It wasn't something they just made up. It wasn't just blatant propaganda. It was no different than making the gangster films in the early 30s when the headlines were full of Al Capone and stuff like that. So he defended their policy, their motion picture policies, you can see in the Motion Picture Daily, quite brilliantly. And the biggest bombshell of this whole investigation, he called attention to Senator Nye, who, if you remember, said he hadn't really seen any of these movies and he couldn't remember. Harry Warner found a telegram sent to the studio from Nye in 1939 after seeing Confessions of a Nazi Spy. So not only had he seen Confessions of a Nazi Spy, he said it was one of the best movies he had ever seen, and he hopes Hollywood will make more movies like this. And it was great reading the press of this day, because every journalist talked about how red Nye's face got, how embarrassed he looked, how quickly he left the courtroom at the end of the day, all this stuff. So Harry Warner, being exactly what you would expect when he takes the stage, not only commanded attention, but pretty much ended the investigation right then and there with this telegram. And surprisingly, this was like the first day that Mcfarland didn't say anything. He didn't ask any questions. He just let it roll. All these other previous days, he had been just like the first day, asking questions and not really getting answers. He had pretty much learned throughout this investigation that none of the senators had seen these movies. And every day he kind of ended the day like, are we going to just go watch? Can we stop and watch these movies so we can see if there's actually anything wrong with them? And of course, that never happens, but there's always talk of that. So a lot of parallels with Washington here. So again, Harry Warner, major day. After this, they bring in a few more people. They bring in Barney Balaban of Paramount. That really doesn't go anywhere as well. Again, more just kind of teaching the senators about how Hollywood works. But when Zanuck comes, now Zanuck got his start with Warner Brothers, so he knows this ripped from the headlines kind of filmmaking. He helped actually invent it, and when he went over to Fox, he brought some of that production expertise with him. But by this point in the investigation, now we're at the end of September 26th. It's pretty clear, not only to Zanuck and other people in Hollywood, but journalists around the country, that this is not only is it falling apart, but there's so many comments throughout the investigation that called attention to anti-Semitism. And really, it's way more overt than you would see today, maybe from politicians anyway. But there was a lot of things, like they would mention Charlie Chaplin, for example, throughout, on and off throughout the investigation. And they would say something like, oh yeah, great filmmaker, but he's not American, right? i.e. he's not born here. So that, and they wouldn't really elaborate, but they would always call attention to when somebody was not from here as a way to kind of quickly discredit them. So there was a lot of, again, that coded language where there's, oh, this person or that person, they're not from here, right? No. Oh, okay, good to know. There was a lot of that kind of rhetoric. So by the time Zanuck shows up, this is all very clear. And when Zanuck sits down at the microphone, he addresses the senators and he said, look, guys, you don't have to worry about me. I'm from Nebraska. I'm from here. So he basically threw all of this 100% Americanism kind of stuff in their face, like, hey, you don't have to fear me. And he did it in this kind of clever and coy way. And again, when the journalists were reporting on this day, apparently the gallery erupted in laughter and applause, because by this time everyone really knew how connected the Senate investigation was to the America First movement and the German-American Bund and all of this stuff that I talked about leading up to this. And that's one of the reasons this fizzled so fast. But what's interesting is, here's some of the press that I had found. Again, a lot of these cartoons were in like the Washington Post and Chicago Tribune and some of the bigger non-LA, non-Hollywood newspapers. So there was a lot of, you can see the one in the middle here, one of my favorites, the Senate subcommittee getting the best comedy Oscar. Just again, it was so clear by the end of this that it was going nowhere, and it was not only was it going nowhere, but it was a joke. It was a misuse of the Interstate Commerce Committee, which is what this was a subcommittee of. But what's interesting, so they disband, and well, they don't disband, they pause. So it's a second recess is what they officially call it at the end of September. They say, we're going to reconvene. Nye and Clark and the rest of them say, promise, we're going to reconvene. We're going to go watch the movies. That never happens. And as late as into November, there's still, I saw in the National Archives, still communication within the committee that they're determined to push this through. We are going to see this through. But of course, that never happens. One of the other things I found in the National Archives is, again, it's one of these things that, you know, there's during the investigation, there's all this coded language, so that it's not overtly anti-Semitic, but you can see how it was interpreted at the time by looking at the press responses, like Zanuck's response, of course. But one of the things that I found was, in one of the senators in the National Archives, they had, I believe it was Burton Wheeler who put all this together. He was the one who appointed everyone on the committee. I'm actually forgetting now if it was Wheeler or if it was D. Worth Clark. But anyway, one of the senators, it's been like 4 years now, one of the senators had a box of letters that was sent to him during the investigation. And every single one of these letters, there was no coded language. It was all, you're doing good work, you know, taking down Jewish Hollywood, all of this kind of stuff. Every single letter, and there were, I don't know, 50 of them, from people all over the country thanking them for finally going after the Jews. And one woman actually put together and included, and I didn't know anything about this. I don't know if any of you listening are familiar with the Franklin prophecy. I was not until I found this. So apparently there is this fake speech that was put together by some members of the Silver Shirts, which is another pro-Nazi American group in the early 30s. And they were distributing this fake speech by Benjamin Franklin that apparently at the Constitutional Congress, he had made this speech arguing that Jews should be written out of the Constitution. So, and apparently it's still used today in some places, but you can Google Franklin prophecy and find this. But I saw this letter, and this woman had included this, said, you're doing what Benjamin Franklin wanted. And I remember as soon as I read that, I'm like, I've never seen this, but I'm pretty sure this isn't right. And of course it's not. But again, this is where all the fans of this investigation, this is where they were. I mean, going back to Charles Coughlin's Social Justice magazine, they were some of the staunchest supporters of this investigation, and they made no secret about their anti-Semitism. So, so really, I mean, that's really where this all comes together. We can see all of these pieces, and we can see how they try to enact it into policy. But as you start peeling back the layers, you can see all of the real intent, the true intentions. And of course, Pearl Harbor happens, and we jump into the war, and that's kind of the obvious reason why this was disbanded. But even still, it wasn't disbanded immediately. It was towards the end of December that they sent the official memo putting it. So that just makes me think that Pearl Harbor happens, and they spent 10 days or so trying to figure out how to keep this going, which is also kind of distressing. So, but anyway, that's a little bit about where we are. And like Ellie said at the beginning, this sets up a lot of groundwork for things that happened after this, right? I mean, HUAC had already been put together in the 30s, and they were investigating all kinds of other things. But of course, this is 41. By 1947, they come after Hollywood again, this time for communist influence. But by that time, Hollywood was not, in 41, they defended themselves brilliantly. It also helped that the senators involved were completely inept. But by 47, after the war and trying to put everything together and recover the economy, I just think the studios were not prepared to defend themselves. And there's another thing I've been thinking about lately. I'm working on a book chapter for an Oxford collection on the blacklist and the fall of Hollywood, the golden age of Hollywood. So I've been thinking about this a lot too, about why did Hollywood defend themselves so well here, and why could they not less than a decade later? But really what this was a trial run for the government to go after a major industry. And it didn't work this time, but it did in 47. So that's probably a good spot to stop.
Yes, so interesting. And I think I've been, piecing together these pieces, especially as we're thinking about, this preparation for the blacklist. Do you think they underestimated the government in 47 because of the experience in 41? So many of the people that you mentioned were called in front of HUAC as well. Warner, Schenck, all of these people, a number of these people were at both hearings. Was there kind of a sense of they don't know what they're doing? It's not even worth our time?
Probably. I think, and it happened so quick too. I mean, they definitely, I'm sure they had every reason to underestimate the government, but I also think I mean, when you look at the Anti-Nazi League and the funding of anti-Nazi espionage going back to the early 30s, these guys were ready by the time 1941 happened. But when you think of, the Hollywood went all in on the war effort. So you got till 45. Then there's all these labor strikes, and they're kind of dealing with all of that. They're dealing with the mob and all kinds of stuff. And now all of a sudden HUAC comes, and now they've got to defend themselves. So they were also really underprepared. And I mean, I came across something recently that even Louis B. Mayer, the staunchest of conservative moguls, was really, really upset when HUAC said they were going to go after Hollywood, because it was when Billy Wilkerson published the names of some people who would eventually be blacklisted in the Hollywood Reporter. Mayer called him and said, "I don't care what their politics are, as long as they do good writing. We don't care about this." So it was bad for business. So it happened so fast that they couldn't do it.
A couple of questions in the chat. One is The Mortal Storm. Wasn't that movie particularly targeted by Goebbels?
Yes, he was. He was very upset at that one. He was very upset at that one, as well as Confession of the Nazi Spy, because there were characters in there that were made on purpose to mirror him. So by the time these movies start coming out, one of the big moves he did is he quit sending propaganda to the United States, because he realized, look, they're just gonna make fun of me now, because they're kind of onto it. So yeah, Goebbels was really irked at these movies, which was the point, of course.
And then another question is the Supreme Court, that they're ruling that film was not protected speech. And Peggy wants to know, when was that overturned? I know this is certainly an impact with Blacklist as well. This came.
That's a really good question, because so that was 1915, 1916. I thought I knew. I saw something recently. I'm gonna have to dig this back up. I saw something recently where someone wanted to look into the state of that hearing, and what I saw a couple years ago was that it actually wasn't ever adequately overturned.
Oh, because I thought it happened in the 1950s that they overturn it. They
might have, but I saw something recently that was somebody looking at the current status of something, and that even if it was overturned, that it was still unclear, is what the perspective from the lawyer that I had seen. But of course, this does come up again in the 40s and 50s about whether or not you can, what kind of things can you say in movies? And this is paralleling the conversations of, is it legal to even be a communist? Like this kind of stuff, right? So I'm not exactly sure what the trajectory of that was, but that's a great question, something I've wanted to look more into. And it's an important one too, because that's something that we need to adequately defend popular culture like this.
And she points out also that these hearings went on for twice as long as an impeachment, which right. I think is also, even as they saw all of this terrible press, and, were they getting a lot of kind of bolstering from constituents, or was it just primarily the kind of leadership of America First that kind of said, no, keep at this? What kept them going, despite the fact that they kind of ended up being embarrassed at the end of each day?
I think it was the America First movement. At every connection I found between Nye and Wheeler and Clark, it was always from them. It was direct connection to America First, and including John Flynn. When he came to testify, he tried to distance himself from America First. He actually said in the beginning, like, I'm here as a journalist, not as a member of America First. But again, by then it was too late. Everybody knew the score, and by 1941, everyone knew. I mean, again, Lindbergh, anytime he opened his mouth, he was on the radio and everybody heard it. It was, across the nation. So, and that was more often than not at America First rallies. So it was not hard to connect those two. And that's why I think if anyone has watched the recent HBO series, The Plot Against America, I think they did a really good job at showing how they even mentioned like Wheeler and Clark. There's some side comments I remember watching that, be like, oh, that was a Senate investigation. They did their research. Yeah, it was hard to miss. And that's one of the things when I was going back and forth about whether or not I should write this book, I was asking another historian friend of mine, Tom Doherty, who wrote a great book called Show Trial on the 47 investigation. Great contemporary perspective. He said that this investigation is important because it was really one of the last times in our culture that the official government was so open about these positions, right? I mean, you can always find these fringe groups that are openly whatever, but the fact that that the Senate would come together, urged by the America First movement, and have this as part of their platform, it's important to look back at that and realize that this happened not only on the national stage, but in the U.S. government.
It's just such a crazy story. I think that we see this and this question around that we are currently in around, you know, cancel culture and those sorts of pieces come into play. Granted, most of that is not coming from government, but I mean, this question of how we respond to media and what media is appropriate certainly is something that we constantly are looking at. Is there any kind of, were there big takeaways that you're like, this is what I learned from this in terms of pro-America? Yes, this is democracy. This is how arts and culture and democracy work in America, and things that you feel are kind of the more negative side of that?
For me, it was really more negative. What this piece is into for me, and I'm actually teaching a class in spring on the history of media censorship, and really where this plugs in is there's a long history of formal movements that eventually go to the government to enact change going after popular culture. So prior to this, you had the Pain Fund studies that were going after Hollywood for the rise of teenage delinquency. You have something similar in the 1950s with movies and comic books. You have in the 80s, you have the parent groups going after rap music. By the late 90s, you have it with video games. Right now, you see with a lot of stand-up comedy. Like there's anywhere you look, there's in different parts of our history, at least the last 100 years or so, there's always a movement like this that's trying to get something they don't like off of national attention. And it comes from various places, but it's of course a bigger deal. It's one thing to have one group lobbying for something they don't like, that, you know, but it's a whole nother thing when they get the government to push that and carry that torch for them. And that's I think what this did, as well as the HUAC hearings in the 40s and 50s, really helped set the template for trying to do that and trying to raise the common theme with all of these is fear, right? It's going to erode the fabric of society, right? The moral fabric of society. You always hear that. So it was the same thing with rock and roll, right? All of our grandparents were saying that was going to ruin the country, right? And then in the 90s, it was video games, right? And, you know, now it's social media. They might be right about social media, but
might actually ruin democracy.
Yeah, they might. If everyone would just, if we could shut down Twitter, we'd all be better. But, right. I mean, there's a long trend of this, and I think the Senate investigation of 41 plugs into it, and we can see lots of similarities.
Well, thank you so much, Chris. It has been a pleasure. I know I have learned so much, and I think it gives us this great context in thinking about culture wars and all of these different pieces that continue to connect. As you guys know, we always have so many programs coming up. This Sunday at 4 o'clock, we have a presentation with author Uwe Westphal it's called Fashion Metropolis Berlin. He is going to bring to life Berlin's fashionable past and describe the rise and destruction of the Jewish fashion industry from 1836 to 1939. On June 10th, we have a virtual tour of the South African Jewish Museum as part of our Global Museum Passport. We hope you'll join us for that. Looking at it actually is a great way to kind of get to know our global Jewish experiences. Through May 30th, Jewish Museum Milwaukee is hosting in person our exhibit To Paint is to Live. We hope you'll come and visit. You can get tickets at jewishmuseummilwaukee.org. You can also buy the book there or online, and we hope to see you soon. And thank you guys so much for joining us.